March 2nd, 2026, 02:17 local time. Beneath the dark surface of the Strait of Hormuz, an Iranian submarine was already in position. At 18 meters depth, a Ghadir-class submarine drifted silently on battery power, holding just outside a major shipping corridor as a U.S. naval surface group transited westbound. If the submarine moved any closer, this would stop being shadowing and start looking like an attack profile. 8 nautical miles to the east, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer cut through the Gulf at 16 knots. Her AN-SPY radar scanned the sky. Beneath her hull, an AN SQS-53 sonar pulsed methodically into the water. A towed array streamed hundreds of meters behind her, listening for anything that did not belong. The destroyer wasn't alone. Above the horizon, maritime patrol aircraft monitored the corridor. Further east, roughly 42 kilometers away, a U.S. carrier strike group maintained formation. The strait may be narrow, but it was not blind. Since February 28th, after Tehran warned that U.S. naval transit through Hormuz would be answered, every passage carried a new risk. Regional naval tracking data later confirmed unusual underwater activity along the transit route that night. No weapons had been fired, but both sides were testing distance. The Ghadir is built exactly for this environment: shallow, noisy, cluttered. At low speed on batteries, it is extremely difficult to detect. But disappearing is not the same as winning. At 5 kilometers, heavyweight torpedoes become realistic. At 3, reaction time collapses to minutes. The Iranian commander had orders to challenge presence, not to fire first. But in Hormuz, intentions can look identical to attack. At 02:21, the Ghadir-class submarine adjusted course 5 degrees to starboard, matching the projected path of the U.S. surface group. Speed, 3 knots. On battery power, that meant near silence, but also very limited endurance. The Strait of Hormuz is shallow, in many sections between 35 and 60 meters deep. That changes everything. In the open ocean, submarines can use depth as protection. Here, there's nowhere to hide. Sound reflects off the seabed, the surface, and the rocky Iranian coastline. Sonar returns bounce unpredictably. Shallow water doesn't make submarines invisible. It makes them harder to classify. Inside the American formation, the lead Arleigh Burke-class destroyer maintained 16 knots. Behind her, a towed array listened passively, optimized to detect the narrow acoustic band of diesel-electric propulsion. The Gulf was noisy that night. Commercial tankers transited southbound. Smaller coastal vessels moved erratically. Water temperature gradients created weak thermoclines that bent sound waves unpredictably. In this environment, a midget submarine could hide, but only up to a point. Inside the Iranian submarine, calculations were being made. The commander knew the rules: demonstrate presence, collect acoustic signatures, avoid escalation. But proximity creates its own logic. The closer they moved, the harder it would be for the Americans to ignore them. For the next 4 minutes, nothing changed. No course correction, no speed variation. Then the distance dropped to 8 kilometers. Now the geometry started to matter. At this range, both sides were entering the threshold where intent and capability begin to overlap. Inside the lead Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the passive sonar operator noticed it first: a faint, irregular rhythm beneath the commercial background noise. Not loud, not obvious, just different. Diesel-electric submarines do not roar. They whisper. The contact appeared intermittently, masked by a southbound tanker crossing the acoustic layer. The towed array registered a narrow band signature inconsistent with surface propulsion. Classification: possible submerged contact, confidence level low. For 2 minutes, the destroyer did nothing. No course change, no speed increase. That was deliberate. In anti-submarine warfare, the first rule is patience. React too early and you reveal what you know. Below, the Ghadir-class submarine continued at 3 knots. The commander had already detected active sonar sweeps earlier in the transit. Distant, methodical. But now something had changed. The destroyer's acoustic pattern felt steadier, less random. 7 kilometers. On the American side, the sonar supervisor elevated the contact to the Combat Information Center. A second operator confirmed a similar frequency band on a separate hydrophone. That reduced the possibility of a false return. Still not confirmed, but no longer dismissed. At 0229, a U.S. Boeing P-8 Poseidon, already on regional overwatch due to heightened tensions since February 28th, was quietly redirected. It did not descend immediately. It widened its orbit first, maintaining ambiguity. Above the strait, the aircraft's radar scanned surface traffic while acoustic processors prepared for possible buoy deployment. Underwater, the geometry tightened. 6 kilometers. On the destroyer, the captain authorized a controlled speed reduction. Minor, barely noticeable. That maneuver alters the acoustic picture. Changes in the propeller load can expose trailing contacts. It's a subtle probe. Seconds later, the passive array registered a faint adjustment in bearing from the suspected submarine. That was enough. At 0232, the P-8 released its first sonobuoy pattern, a passive line across the projected submarine track. Small cylindrical sensors splashed into the water, deploying hydrophones beneath the surface. It drifted, listening. From 18 meters below, the Iranian crew heard it. Multiple splashes, not random, patterned. Now the other side had a vote. At this range, ambiguity begins to collapse. If the destroyer classified the contact as hostile intent, escalation protocols could activate quickly. Depth charges are no longer standard doctrine, but practice warning detonations and aggressive action sonar bursts remain tools of signaling. The P-8's acoustic processor began correlating buoy returns. Weak but consistent broadband noise aligned with the destroyer's earlier contact. Confidence level rising. For the next 60 seconds, no one said a word unnecessarily on either vessel. In Washington and Tehran, no one yet knew how close the geometry had become. 3.7 kilometers. If a torpedo were fired now, the destroyer would have perhaps 3 to 4 minutes to detect, classify, deploy countermeasures, and maneuver. But no torpedo left the tube. Instead, the destroyer made its move. At 0234, the AN/SQS-53 shifted from passive listening to a single, powerful active sonar pulse. The sound hit the water like a hammer, and everything changed. The active sonar pulse tore through the water at 0234. From the hull of the Arleigh-Burke-class destroyer, an AN/SQS-53 emitted a low-frequency blast powerful enough to travel for miles in shallow water. Unlike passive listening, active sonar does not wait. It announces itself. And the carrier strike group sat only 42 kilometers away. A torpedo launch would not be answered by one destroyer. It would be answered by everything. Inside the U.S. Combat Information Center, the contact solution sharpened with the active return. The sonar pulse painted a clearer shape. Small hull, short length, shallow profile, consistent with a midget submarine. Rules of engagement in this phase were calibrated for deterrence. The destroyer did not fire. Instead, it maneuvered. At 0236, the helm ordered a controlled turn toward the contact bearing. Speed increased to 20 knots. That shift alone changed the acoustic geometry. A destroyer closing distance forces a diesel-electric submarine into a dilemma. Stay quiet and risk overrun, or maneuver and reveal propulsion noise. On the destroyer's displays, the submarine contact had shifted slightly, a small but unmistakable change in bearing. The Ghadir was turning, not toward attack position, but away. The challenge had been made and answered. Had the Iranian commander made a different decision at 3.5 kilometers, the Strait of Hormuz could have ignited within minutes. A single 533mm torpedo launched from the Ghadir-class submarine would have forced the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer into immediate defensive action. The destroyer's AN/SLQ-25 Nixie decoy would deploy, streaming acoustic countermeasures behind the ship to lure the incoming weapon away. Simultaneously, the helm would order a hard turn at flank speed, attempting to comb the wake and reduce the target profile. But in shallow water, evasion margins shrink. Bottom reflections interfere with torpedo guidance, countermeasures can become less predictable, and reaction time, under 4 minutes at that range, leaves almost no buffer for error. If the torpedo struck, escalation would not remain localized. The carrier strike group positioned 42 kilometers east would immediately assume hostile intent. Maritime patrol aircraft would switch from surveillance to prosecution. Additional destroyers would tighten formation. Submarine hunting helicopters would flood the corridor. And then Tehran would face a decision of its own. Was this a limited naval clash or the opening of a broader conflict? Even without the impact, a confirmed torpedo launch would likely trigger retaliatory action against Iranian naval assets in the region. Coastal bases, missile batteries, and additional submarines would become targets within hours. All of it triggered by a closing distance measured in kilometers. Instead, the Ghadir turned away. But the geometry that night proved something critical. The line between signaling and shooting in Hormuz is thinner than it looks. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer maintained course but held active tracking for several more minutes, ensuring that the submarine continued to withdraw. No torpedoes were fired, no depth charges were dropped, but for nearly 15 minutes both sides operated inside engagement range. Regional naval monitoring later confirmed the close underwater encounter. The strait remained open to transit that night, but under heightened patrol conditions. Maritime aircraft continued overwatch until sunrise. The message had been delivered. Presence was acknowledged, escalation avoided. What happened that night was not an accident. Since February 28th, every U.S. transit through the Strait of Hormuz has carried strategic weight. Iran is signaling that it can contest access below the surface. The United States is signaling that even in shallow, cluttered water, it can find and track what moves. This was not a battle, it was a test. A test of distance, a test of discipline, a test of how close two adversaries are willing to get before someone miscalculates. The submarine challenged presence. The destroyer answered with precision. No explosions, no headlines about lost ships. But make no mistake, at 3 kilometers, this was no routine transit. The next encounter may not end the same way. Do you think this was a calculated signal or a dangerous game that could spiral out of control? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you value detailed military reconstructions like this video and subscribe to help the channel grow. I'll see you in the next one.